This is John Gold here with Dr. Peter Dale Scott. Dr. Scott, you have been involved in the secrecy of the American government for years upon years, and I think a lot of people within the movement aren't familiar with your work, which has been a foundation for a lot of other people's work. Tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get started in all of this?
Well, I was a Canadian diplomat for 4 years, and it sounds totally irrelevant because I was in Poland. But by the accident that Poland and Canada were both on the International Control Commission for the Geneva Agreements on Indochina, it meant that as the lowest man in the Canadian legation in Warsaw, it was my job to read all these lengthy cables from Indochina. And then I left the Foreign Service and I went to teach at Berkeley in '61, and I thought, really, at that time I was leaving the study of foreign policy and probably politics. But almost immediately I became very concerned that America was going to get involved in a war in Indochina, which would be as bad for America as it had been for France, which is what the cables were mostly about. So I started to get involved in initially it was just petitions, and I actually taught in Vietnam in my class to a lot of students who'd never heard of Vietnam at that time. It's hard to believe. And eventually I wrote what was probably the first anti-war book with 2 other people. And in the course of writing that book, I just posed it as a question in the book, whether the change of policy towards Vietnam, which occurred at the time of the 2 assassinations, Diem in Vietnam and Kennedy in Dallas, that was just a coincidence or whether there was some deeper force behind it. Well, almost everything that I've done ever since grew out of that initial question.
A lot of your work has revolved around the CIA. What initially interested you about the CIA? Like, how did you become involved looking into the CIA and things that they're doing?
Well, there were questions raised in the mainstream media about CIA in Vietnam at the time, just before Kennedy's assassination. And one of the regular New York Times columnists, I forget who, asked a question whether the CIA was essentially running its own policy in Vietnam. So that was something I had to check out. And then I became very interested in Laos, and I was one of the first people to really look deeply into Laos. And there, of course, the CIA was just running its own war, and also a theme that became important for me later, doing it by sponsoring people who were involved in the drug traffic there. You had a neutralist premier, you had a left-wing alternative, and then you had a right-wing alternative that was practically invented by the CIA with support from Thailand, which was supporting itself by drug trafficking.
Right. Was this the Air America?
Well, Air America became involved in it, and I did do an early article about Air America, yes.
Okay. You said you were a diplomat. Have you ever been involved in other politics? Have you ever run for anything?
Oh, no. Well, my father helped start the Canadian Socialist Party, the CCF, it was called originally. It's the New Democratic Party now. So I was involved in precinct politics at the age of 12. But as I moved away from Canada and moved away from my father's influence, I never became an American citizen, so I've not had much adult experience of party politics.
Okay. One of the things that you like to write about, and I know this is an intense topic and it's very hard to explain, is deep politics. And I was wondering if you could give a simple synopsis of a definition of what deep politics is.
Yeah, I would begin by, originally I was writing about parapolitics, and that's much easier to explain. That's when a government's doing false flag operations or covert operations, anything where something is happening but you don't see the government's involvement in it. That's parapolitics.
Right.
And that became not an adequate topic for everything I wanted to talk about, because so many operations that began as parapolitics then acquired a life and energy of their own. And the example that I gave in my book, Deep Politics, was the CIA bringing in the American mafia to fight communists in Italy and Sicily, and installing them there, and they then became involved in drug trafficking in Italy, and drugs which came back to America. Now, a lot of people call that blowback, but I don't think that's a good term, because blowback is a term that began in the First World War, where you would blow gas towards the enemy and the winds would change and some of the gas would come back to you. But the problem with the mafia in Italy was not just that some of the consequences came back to us, but that the CIA had spawned an operation which became independent and became a major, major force in Italian politics and in European drug trafficking, so that it went beyond blowback, so to speak.
There was somebody, I can't remember his name, from Italy who just passed away, who was very controversial. Was he involved in that, or you know who I'm talking about?
No, I'm not sure I do. Unless it was Gelli, Licio Gelli.
I think that might have been his name.
Well, yes, the CIA actually, in its desire to prevent, Italy had a series of coalition governments, and the great CIA fear, or American fear, it wasn't just CIA, was that you would have a coalition government of a NATO country that had a communist party in the coalition, which actually was the way things were in France at the beginning, right after the war. The CIA was dedicated to stopping that. So they did many, many things, not just the mafia.
Was this the strategy of tension?
The strategy of tension, let's define what that is.
Okay.
That's the use of false flag violence in order to frighten people into supporting a coercive right-wing government. And Italy had some spectacular examples of it. A bombing in the Piazza Fontana in Milan, which I think killed 68 people, and then a later bombing in the Bologna railway station, which killed more than 80 people. And originally it was blamed on anarchists, and it's true in a sense that an anarchist cell was involved, but that anarchist cell was totally penetrated and controlled by people from Italian military intelligence. Well, that sounds like it's an Italian problem, but when they finally arrested and tried some of the people who had ordered these operations, more than one of them said, well, yes, but they were doing it with CIA approval. What we can see definitely is that the arms that were used came from a CIA operation called Gladio, these so-called stay-behind forces, which were to be there if the communists ever took over Italy. There would then be these right-wing cells. It's often said that Gladio was responsible for the strategy of tension. I think that's too simple, but I think it's true that all of these covert structural arrangements for stay behind, for Gladio, then became exploited and used for the strategy of tension, so that the CIA is not innocent in this. And in addition, William Harvey, who was the chief of station for the CIA in Rome, he has been recorded by a very prominent Italian author as having personally advocated strategy of tension, that is to say, recruiting people to do covert, to commit violence, which would then be blamed on the left.
Okay. A lot of your work has focused on the JFK assassination, and I know that you don't focus as much on the physical evidence, but more of the who benefited, I guess, the larger scheme of things.
Well, I'm very interested in the documents that have come out, FBI documents, CIA documents. I study those quite closely. But you know, I'm so ignorant when it comes to guns.
Right.
There are any number of people. The first wave of investigators focused very much on Dealey Plaza and who photographed what from where. So I've never tried to compete on those grounds. They do micro-analysis of the scene. I do macro-analysis of what was happening in the country at the time.
I know this is a difficult question, but who do you think ultimately was behind the assassination?
Well, that's where I wrote this book, Deep Politics, The Death of JFK, to say that the more you study American society, you realize there are these deep forces at work that bridge the apparent gap between the upper world and the underworld, and that in fact cooperations between, I call it the overworld now, and the underworld are far from rare in American society and probably in any advanced society. And my answer was that in that book, I wasn't trying to solve who did it, but I came in the end to the conclusion that to understand how it could happen, you had to look at these deep forces, and that somewhere in those plural number of deep political arrangements would be the answer.
Is it true that George Bush Sr. May have had something to do with the assassination?
I think it's one of the interesting new developments is that undoubtedly George Bush Sr. was involved with the CIA long before he became the director in 1960s.
Right, and I think that just came out in publications that said he definitely from the 50s had relationships to the CIA.
The fact is, he started this offshore drilling company, Zapata. And Zapata worked with the CIA, and I think that, not many people know this, but that George Bush Sr. his company was drilling in the offshore waters off Kuwait. And this meant special connections with the Kuwait government and an important source of income for the Kuwait government, although they had others. And the CIA was involved in that, and we have documents that prove this.
Right.
There are also disputed documents that say that, well, we know that George Bush actually contacted the CIA to tell them about right-wingers in Texas. That doesn't implicate him in anything. There's another document that talks about information being given to George Bush, and here there's been a debate whether it's the same George Bush or not.
You're talking about the McCullum memo?
Well, my memory's not good on
Okay.
this. It's always seemed to me that even if it was the George Bush that the people thought it was, it still isn't really a culpable document. It doesn't implicate him in the assassination.
What do you think? I understand that John F. Kennedy was in the process or considering repealing the Federal Reserve Act. Is that the case?
That's certainly alleged, and I would certainly be interested in that. I actually wrote about Kennedy and financial things in an essay which has not been picked up very much. I think that one of the reasons that Kennedy was considering pulling troops out of Vietnam was because he was very worried about the status of the dollar, about the balance of payments, the fact that we were spending abroad far more than we were earning, so that our gold stocks were being drawn down conspicuously even in the early 60s. It became a crisis. And finally in 1968 we effectively went off the gold standard in support of the dollar. Process concluded in 71. A rather technical essay I wrote indicated that Kennedy's solution was to allow U.S. investments abroad, but to cut back on U.S. expenditures on troops abroad. And one of the things that happened almost instantly after Johnson came to power was that Johnson established controls on U.S. investments abroad, which I think was to liberate up the capacity to spend more on U.S. troops abroad, because they were already envisaging a troop buildup in Vietnam.
Okay, in regards to 9/11, at what point after 9/11 or during 9/11 did you become suspicious to the point where you were going to start researching it?
Well, I had just finished a book, as I thought, and dated the preface, the last part of it, August 30th, 2001. And 11 days later, the book was going to be Drugs, Oil, and War in Indochina and Colombia. And 11 days later, we had 9/11, and my first thought was, well, my book now is irrelevant, it's past history. And 24 hours later, I said, no, I've written the right book to understand what's happening here, except that I'm going to have to add a third section on Afghanistan, because it was already obvious a month before it happened that we were going to go into Afghanistan. And the paradigm of using drug traffickers in an area of interest to oil companies, or in this case gas companies perhaps.
Well, in regards to the Caspian Sea pipeline, which is what they wanted to build.
And they wanted to build pipelines through Afghanistan as
right,
well.
exactly. That's what I'm talking about, the Caspian Sea pipeline.
No, but the Caspian Sea pipeline goes west from Turkmenistan under the Caspian Sea and comes out eventually in Turkey. But this was a different pipeline that didn't visit the Caspian Atoll, that came down through, never got built. They're still hoping to build it.
Right, exactly. I was just going to say.
From Turkmenistan down to Pakistan, the first one would have been gas, but they wanted to build an oil one as well. They still want to do that. And it's very striking that a lot of the key fighting is in Paktia, the parts of Pakistan, of Afghanistan that the pipeline would have to run through.
Right. People have said, well, if they wanted to go into Afghanistan to build a pipeline, why isn't the pipeline?
It's not just the pipeline.
Oh, right, obviously, and I'm going to get to that in a second.
Yeah.
But I have said that it's very possible that they just poorly planned for the invasion. They didn't expect people to fight against an invasion. And that's possibly the reason why it has yet to be built, because of poor planning. Do you think that might have something to do with it?
I think the problem in Afghanistan is, we've done a terrible job in Afghanistan in terms of bringing peace to that country, but so has every other government. So in other words, the level of comparison in Afghanistan was so low that almost anything we did would have been an improvement, and could have been an improvement. And what went wrong, I think, is not so much bad planning as the supersession of interest in Afghanistan by commitment of resources to Iraq. That America promised aid to Afghanistan, it didn't deliver on. It promised pacification, which didn't happen. It tried to do things very much on the cheap, and that means using air power, which is not a way to win the hearts and minds of the people. So, and even so, it's a terrible screw-up. It's not as bad as the Soviets, and many people would say, it depends from your point of view, but some people would say not as bad as the Taliban.
Right.
I've always been more, I'm against U.S. interventions in general, but one of the ones I've been least against was going into Afghanistan, because I concede there really was a problem of training camps, and Pakistan was not going to do anything about it. And so that could have been an operation which could have, in theory, have been a display of something that we've almost never seen since World War II, is a really beneficent U.S. occupation with a happy ending. But it hasn't worked that way because, as I say, under commitment of resources because of Iraq.
Right. The opium of Afghanistan, the poppy fields, now after our invasion, well, prior to the invasion, the Taliban managed to eradicate, I think it was 90%
Well, yeah, but in perspective, the first years of the Taliban, they were living off it.
Right.
And then there was kind of an ultimatum from the United States: if you want any aid, you have to stop it. And the Taliban, being a fairly brutal regime, was able to stop it quite efficiently through the south. They only really controlled the south. And at this point, you only had one area of Afghanistan now which was growing opium poppy, and it trebled its production. That was the area under the Northern Alliance. Well, when we went in an alliance initially with the Northern Alliance. The State Department was unhappy about working with drug traffickers, but the CIA does it all the time, and they did it once again. And it's more than that. Then they had to build up a network in the south, and they hooked up with warlords and who had been involved in the drug traffic back in the 1980s when the CIA was very active against the Soviet Union. And they even arranged for one of the most prominent drug traffickers to be released suddenly from a jail in Pakistan. And worse even than that, I think the British were involved in this too. MI6, the British, and CIA went to a retired trafficker living in Dijon, France, and said, "Come back, we need you. We're starting up operations again," because they wanted to control the Khyber Pass area in Jalalabad. All that area is a major drug an opium growing area, heroin producing area, and above all, a pipeline of heroin down into Pakistan. So we went in alliance with drug traffickers, and it's hardly a surprise, therefore, that we now have the drug traffic in high business in Afghanistan. There's a reversal here. When the Taliban were controlling Kabul, they controlled the south of the country, and they eliminated drugs in the south of the country. When the CIA came back in, they were working, now it's the north that controls Kabul, and the drug trafficking is now principally in the south, again, to finance groups in opposition to the Northern Alliance, who, by the way, mostly speak Farsi, so they're not very popular in the south, which speaks Pashtun. And it's no surprise that more and more these forces are becoming coalesced around a renewed presence of the Taliban, who were initially pretty completely defeated, but are reviving themselves on the drug trade, just the way the Northern Alliance before the American invasion.
There's something that's always confused me, the fact that the United States government both fights against the drugs that are being grown in Afghanistan, and also, obviously the money that's made. You said earlier that 80% of the money made is in the consuming portions of the world, the people who actually consume the drugs.
Yes.
Could you expand on that, explain the contradiction, helping to eradicate the drugs and also helping to sell the drugs?
Well, we have, they say America's a pluralistic society, and it's also a pluralistic bureaucracy. And you have one part of the bureaucracy, DEA, which is supposed to be eliminating the thing, and you have another part of the bureaucracy, the CIA, which is supposed to be fighting America's enemies, and repeatedly and consistently and predictably does so in alliance with drug traffickers. Now then, there's another question, and you actually raised it in your question. Maybe there are some people in America who don't want to see the drug traffic disappear because they're making too much money from it.
Right.
That is a question I think about all the time, and the problem is it's hard to gather evidence for it. But I've got an essay coming out in a month or so in an anthology about Mexico, and it's very clear that Americans certain specific American banks have had a very direct economic stake in the Mexican drug traffic. You had one Los Angeles bank that had something like $20 million a month going through a single account, and that's only one account. That's not the whole traffic.
I think it was Citibank that had affiliations with that.
Well, that's going to come then to the question of the banking of the profits. And yes, Citibank, but it's not just Citibank, 4 or 5 or 6 leading banks and investment banks, they set up special arrangements, in effect, for private banks, where funds could be secretly deposited, not having to meet the normal degree of transparency for U.S. government purposes. And it wouldn't, you know, if we really had justice in this country, we might have seen major bank officials of the top banks going to jail. One reason we didn't is that twice now America has intervened to make emergency loans to save the peso. The first time was in, I think, 1983, and the second time was in 1994. And both times, these loans were made by the United States knowing that they would be repaid from profits from the drug trade, because the first time they actually commissioned a study from the CIA that's indicated, the language is very weaselly, but it's indicating that maybe 75% of Mexican foreign exchange earnings, which is what you need to pay back a loan, was being made from the drug trade, certainly more than from oil. And the same thing was, the second study was done in the 90s by the Mexican Attorney General, and he said more than 50% of our foreign exchange earnings are from drugs. That made it possible for Clinton to make a huge emergency loan overnight of about $40 billion. Both times, if he hadn't done that, particularly the first time, major U.S. banks would have been technically bankrupt, because they would have had to write off such a large percentage of their foreign loans that they wouldn't have had assets to meet the federal requirements.
So the drug trade develops a cash flow for the banks, as well as puts money in the pockets of the bankers, most likely.
The cash flow and the deposits are two really different things, because one is permanent and the other is transitory.
There has been question as to whether or not we could have gone into Afghanistan without 9/11, and based on the United Nations Charter, the Nuremberg Charter, which prohibits preemptive invasions, obviously
this was tearing up the whole post-war arrangements for international peace and security.
Do you think they could have done it without 9/11?
My personal belief, which is not something based on evidence now, just my belief, is 9/11 happened in order to fulfill the agendas of people like Afghanistan and ultimately Iraq. Yes.
Right. I don't think that the American public would have supported an invasion such as that without the 9/11 attack, so we basically agree on that.
And I just say, in case if anybody here doesn't know it, but probably nearly all of you do, that you had a number of sources, one of them being the Project for a New American Century, who laid out an agenda which included military intervention in the Middle East, and said we're not likely to get it absent a major crisis, a new Pearl Harbor.
The interesting thing about Rebuilding America's Defenses, that document, the phrase process of transformation is mentioned 27 times in that document.
Right.
So do you think they cared about the process of transformation? I mean, if you were to write that in a school paper, you would get an F for repeating that phrase over and over again.
But it's also interesting the number of places that the idea of a crisis or a Pearl Harbor being necessary. It's in Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard. There's something very like it in one of the Defense Department documents. I think it was for the space program. I think this was common talk in Washington. And some people, I believe, went ahead and acted on it. But if that's just a belief, I don't have the evidence for that.
All right. Regards to 9/11, I know a lot of your focus has been on Cheney in the bunker. And the biggest thing that stands out to me is there's obviously something wrong with that entire story, because the 9/11 Commission report reports him as being there at 9:58. We have a reporter from ABC News that says he left for the PEOC a little after 9. We have Richard Clark also saying that he left a little bit after 9 to go.
It's not quite clear, but certainly long.
Right.
In the order from the Clark book, you would guess certainly the latest around 9:20.
Okay, and then we have Norman Mineta's testimony.
You have Cheney's testimony. Cheney said in his interview with Tim Russert on September 16th, 5 days later, when his memory was fresh, that he went down in the bunker and arrived before the Pentagon was hit. That means before 9:37.
I don't remember ever seeing that.
Well, you'll see it in my book when it comes out in the fall.
Well, that's
You'll
huge.
hear it from me tomorrow.
Okay, so
And by the way, I shared that with David Ray Griffin, and you will now see it in David Ray Griffin's book as well.
that's amazing. I never knew that.
So Cheney gave two different stories, and they're in conflict. One of them has to be false, not necessarily a lie, but one of them definitely has to be false.
Yeah, well, especially considering all of the accounts telling that Cheney was down there before 9:58.
And this it doesn't just make Cheney look bad, but initially it makes the commission look bad, and the report look bad.
Well, the fact that
because they had, I don't want to give the whole of tomorrow's talk
Right.
here, but in essence, there were a number of places where there were two conflicting stories, and consistently the report would go for the story which minimizes the role of Cheney. And when you get a consistent pattern of not looking at the obvious evidence, I mean, here's Norman Mineta is a member of the cabinet, he was there, he's an eyewitness. They ignore what he had to say about the order to land, and they prefer the story of Ben Sliney, who's a little nobody, who was first day on the job. He's the only person mentioned about the order to land in the report.
Right.
So that there is a systematic slanting in the report, which is to protect Cheney. That is
Which says a
symptom.
lot.
Yes,
So-
that's my negative template here that I developed in Deep Politics. When they're consistently suppressing something, you become interested in what's
Exactly.
being suppressed.
So, the Energy Task Force, from which Dick Cheney was the head of, do you think that had a lot to do with 9/11, the planning for 9/11?
I think it had a lot to do with Iraq. I don't know. No,
Well, right, it's speculative to say it had something to do with 9/11, but the fact that they were planning for wars with Iraq that required a pretext, such as 9/11.
I'd be more suspicious of what's being called Cheney's second task force. He was asked on May the 8th, I think, to...
Right, the terrorism task.
yes, it wasn't... I mean, it was called a task force in the press. It was not called a task force by the government. But it was, in effect, a task force, and I'm suspicious of it because it teamed Cheney up with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and that was, they were linking up again in the terrorism field because FEMA had been backstopping this special group planning for continuity of government in the 1980s, which I think is the key to the crisis that we're in now.
Right.
And it was extra constitutional. The Congress didn't know about it. It was set up by the Reagan's National Security Council, and I think it was frankly a highly irregular situation. It was supposed to be extreme because it was dealing with a nuclear disaster, and the books by Bamford and James Mann about this planning for continuity of government in the 1980s say it was for a nuclear disaster, but they don't mention that before the Reagan government went out of the administration went out of existence, they passed an executive order which expanded it from nuclear planning to any kind of emergency. Their definition, which they gave, would cover 9/11, and the proof of this is that continuity of government was actually instituted by Cheney on September the 11th, and that is, I think, is the least understood aspect of 9/11.
That basically put him in charge? Is that how it goes?
Well, we don't know, you
Right.
see. We do know that Cheney didn't leave. It's supposed to, first of all, provide for alternative government outside of Washington. Cheney didn't go, Rumsfeld didn't go, but after things settled down, Cheney did go, and about 100 people spent weeks in these hollowed out mountains which had been developed.
Right, I remember that. Cheney was gone. He disappeared off the
Yeah.
face of the earth.
And Wolfowitz was spending time in what they call Site R, which is another hollow. Well, I mean, I think Cheney and Wolfowitz were both in Site R. It's a mountain somewhere up on the border of Maryland. What I predict they were doing was implementing the planning that was described about Oliver North, who was also working on this project back in the mid-1980s. And there was a fairly lengthy description of what that planning was. It was mass detention without warrants. It was warrantless surveillance. It was deportation of people by guilt of association with other people. You have a whole agenda of things which were being planned, and this is the most amazing thing of all. A very small group of people, one of whom was Cheney, who was only a congressman, and another of whom was Rumsfeld, even though he wasn't in the government at all. And yet he was sort of trumping or overriding the constitutional arrangements that we have had protecting us since the 18th century.
Right, I remember a story about how Cheney and Rumsfeld fought for wiretaps back in the 70s during the Ford administration.
Absolutely, yes.
So it's funny how history repeats itself. I mean, again, in the 70s, Rumsfeld was saying that Russia was building up their weapons of mass destruction, which they were not.
Well, I mean, you could have a debate about that. Not to the extent that people said they were.
Right, exactly. Not to the extent. It's always about to the extent, because they always oversell.
I do actually think that Russia did embark upon an insane program of missile development, but it was because of their feeling of vulnerability that the two powers were, to some extent, genuinely terrified of each other and using it. To what extent it was genuine is hard to establish, but in the final stages, it became a spending race in which America was trying to spend Russia into the ground.
Right, exactly, which was what the...
And in combination, if I might add, with a systematic program to lower oil prices so that Russia was getting it at both ends. They had these expensive programs which they thought they could pay for, but then when the people under Casey and the CIA were boasted about this, when they were able to bring down oil prices, then the Gorbachev regime was left high and dry, and that really not only spelled an end to the Soviet Union, but in the end, an end to Gorbachev. Wouldn't we be better off with Gorbachev? You know why we had to go on destroy, just out of this mad sense of we can do it, so we're going to do it.
Well, I think
it's insanity.
It had something to do with what's happening today. You know, we destroyed Russia financially, and now we have the ability to police the world and
Well,
such.
we don't have the ability
Well,
to
right.
police the world. We thought we had the ability
Exactly,
to police
and
the world.
that's-
It only took one disastrous experiment, Iraq, to prove that we don't. And we
Exactly.
can't, I've heard talk at this conference of our going into Iran. Well, I can predict we may bomb Iran, we may nuke Iran. We're not going to go into Iran because we don't even have enough troops to go into certain corners of Iraq.
Right. Exactly. They're having recruiting problems.
It's a disaster all around.
Yeah. All right.
And one of the great tragic losses in this is that there could have been a good program in Afghanistan. America's motives were not the worst in Afghanistan, and it's probably not going to happen because America is so overextended now.
One last question. How much would you like to know the name of the young man Norman Mineta was referring to during his testimony before the 9/11 Commission? The one that came in and out of the room telling Cheney he was 50 miles out.
What I really would like to get is the videotape
Right.
of Richard Clark's teleconference. Because if we had that, I think it would totally disprove the chronology that the 9/11 report tried so elaborately to establish, and I think would probably constitute a very pressing reason to get Richard Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld hauled before a congressional committee and required to testify under oath, which could lead, I believe, to impeachment. I don't think we're ready for impeachment until we have had Cheney testify under oath.
Right.
And then I think that he's either got to sort of confess and retire from politics.
I'm sorry. Somehow he's managed to stay out of the Libby trial, even though they wanted him to be there to testify. It's just amazing.
Looked for, I thought maybe for a while that Fitzgerald had a strategy to use the Libby trial to get Cheney, but it didn't happen, and he was very peeved, by the way, that Libby didn't testify and Cheney didn't testify. I don't think that story is over yet, and of course a lot will depend on what the grand jury does now.
Thank you very much, Peter Dale Scott, for your time. This is John Gold signing off.